Hi, everyone. Welcome back from the break. Thanks for joining us and being here again. We're on to our next set of speakers, Rifa and Samaya, who are going to be speaking to keeping women safe and filling the gap with system navigation. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to Rifa and Samaya to get us going.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our presentation, Keeping Women Safe, Filling the Gap with System Navigation. I'm going to start with a brief land acknowledgement. We're calling in today from the unceded, unsurrendered land of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, now known as Ottawa. I want us to really think about what that means and what is a land acknowledgement. The statement bears witness to theft, a lack of reconciliation, a loss of culture, a loss of language, identity for the stewards of this land. And when I think of land, it often makes me think of the trees that keep us grounded. And those who know me that know that there are many things that captivate me. Water, the stars, the bees, and the trees. And I wanted to focus briefly on the trees. Trees are social beings. They learn from each other, they hold each other, they nurse each other, they count, they warn each other when they're in danger, and for reasons unknown, they also send nourishment to dead roots. The system navigation that we're talking about today is how I want us to think about community. I don't believe self-care is focusing inward. I believe it is rooted in community care and practice. That when we hold each other, when we nurse each other, and when we send strength to each other, it teaches us, just like the trees, that in community we can thrive.
Hi, everybody. I'm Rifa. I'm one of the C6 counselors here. I'm not sure whose microphone I'm getting that feedback from. Okay, there we go. Just providing peer counseling and system navigation support to survivors of gender-based violence. I'm also a survivor myself. I'm zooming in from unceded, unsurrendered Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation territory, also known as Ottawa. We'd love to know who's joining us today. So if you'd like to introduce yourself in the chat and share with us what brings you to this presentation today, you can do that in the chat. Samaya, did you want to introduce yourself as well?
I can. So my name is Samaya. I am one of the C6 counselors. I'm also the engagement coordinator for Women at the Center, and I wear many hats here. And I'm also a survivor.
So just a quick activation warning. We're offering a gentle reminder that we're going to be discussing gender-based violence and systemic violence as well. Please don't be afraid to step away and take care of yourself in whatever way you need. You can pause the session and come back to it. I don't think that this session is recorded actually, so you might not be able to come back to it, but you can feel free to exit the session or just take a break. Whatever you do, we won't be offended. And reach out to someone for support if you are feeling like you need it. And just a small disclaimer I like to say is that I often say something like my survivor or your survivor, because we don't call the survivors that we support clients, just because it's easier than saying the survivor that you are supporting every time, so that I'm not tripping on my words, but I just want to make sure to offer that so that it's not taken the wrong way. You can go to the next slide. Okay, so just a quick overview of what we're going to be discussing in the next little bit of time that we have together. So we're going to be talking about why system navigation support is crucial for many survivors. We'll talk about some of those gaps and barriers. We'll talk about the need for system navigation and advocacy and how we do them. And we'll take a look together at a sort of process flowchart that we've created to assist counselors consider different support paths and some aspects of supporting survivors in some key areas like housing, legal systems. And then we're hoping to have a few minutes at the end for questions and answers, but our contact information is also going to be shared if you would like to follow up about anything with either of us. Back to you, Samaya.
So the why system navigation is important. And one of the main reasons, and not the only reason, is femicide. Every 48 hours, a woman, a girl, is killed in Canada. In 2022, 187 women were killed. And when we talk about the crisis of femicide in Canada, we can't miss the conversation around the missing and murdered Indigenous women. And when Canada also is collecting stats on who is being murdered, we're not looking at the stats of Black women. I do welcome folks to look into a Marginar code. I think Sandy may be able to put it in the chat. Hopefully, our brilliant ED, Neka McGregor, has taken this upon herself to make sure that we are accounting for the Black women that are murdered in Canada that hasn't been documented before. When we look at also the why, survivors fall through the gaps. Like navigating systems is important even when you know the systems. And if you start thinking about language barriers, when you start thinking about, just navigating the system without any knowledge from before, even knowing the language, you would have a hard time navigating the systems. And systems often don't even talk to each other. So a lot of times the women that fell through the gaps, like they were navigating within different systems like child welfare, the legal system, they may have been in housing, and you have all these systems that have different pieces of the story, but when they're not speaking to each other, often for confidentiality reasons, people fall through these gaps.
So I'd like to just give us a minute to pause and take in this image for a moment. And I'd love it if you post in the chat if you would like. You can share what hits you when you look at this image. So a little bit of background. This brilliant slide was created by our beloved Neka. The animated version is quite impactful as well in seeing the weight quickly pile on to the survivor and their child in the center. I spend a large portion of my job helping survivors feel like they're not crazy for feeling and coping as they do. Giving them permission to have a hard time or to feel exactly as they're feeling when they're dealing with these things. So I've used this as a visual resource to support women who are navigating some of these experiences, to validate why they're feeling the way they are, for the ways that they're coping, even the ways that they're not so proud of, that survivors often blame themselves for. And when you have this visual representation, you can really see, all of the things that a survivor is having to navigate on a daily basis. I'm seeing in the chat, it's overwhelming. It's the maze that we navigate. Yes.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about how C6 peer counseling started. So it started a little bit before that. We did strangulation research back in 2012, I don't remember. And we had come up with this concept of the 4 C's of strangulation. And our brilliant Neka came up with the 6 C's of counseling: the context, communication, consequences, care, control. And in 2019, I piloted the program with one survivor. And in that first pilot, I found that the survivor didn't really need that emotional piece of support. The survivor needed more of that system navigation support and safety planning. So that's when we started to really think about how C6 works best for the survivor. And in 2022, we did win the Purple Ribbon Award for the best program for shelters. So that was one of our achievements. When we have folks that come into this program, we usually pair them with someone who shares parts of their identity so that they feel comfortable. Often when we have people who don't look like us or speak the same language or understand our unique experiences, it's harder to disclose. What we did find while we were carrying out C6 is that we were kind of limited with the amount of weeks that we were allotted to support a survivor. And our management teams were extremely supportive in allowing us to spend more time with survivors, increasing time with them. So it's kind of like a scale. Some folks need 4 weeks, some folks need 8 weeks, some folks need 24 weeks. And we really do try to accommodate folks to ensure that we're not just letting them go because our program is over. What we did find, though, is that the C6 program, in terms of just focusing on that emotional piece, did not meet the needs for survivors.
I think you need to go back one slide. Yeah. Okay, so system navigation support is basically helping survivors find their way through the maze of different services, organizations, systems that they have to go through on their journey to finding safety and healing. And it's not just being their guide through the complicated process of accessing legal support and housing and other services, but also of navigating other complex experiences. Like some of our survivors are self-representing in family court with their aggressor, which we just heard about in Madhuri's wonderful presentation. They have children's aid involvement, or they need to relocate to another city for their safety, or they're really struggling with parenting small children through, everything that they are dealing with. So we support survivors to understand their options, gain access to the services that they need, and navigate these various systems as effectively as possible during what is usually a very overwhelming and challenging time for them. And then depending on the level of support that the survivor needs, and whether they're also dealing with a language barrier as a newcomer or face other challenges, this can also look more like what's usually called case management, where you're having a more involved role in not just showing them the system and helping them navigate the system, but you're kind of taking a more active role in doing things at the survivor's request that they need, because it's just all too much. And oftentimes these barriers make it almost impossible for some survivors to do some of the simple things on their own as well. This is not ever about taking over someone's life, telling them what to do, not respecting their choices and wishes. We always support a survivor's agency and autonomy and complete ownership over their life path and their choices, even when they're making decisions that we might not think are in their best interest or may not be in line with the legal advice that they've received. For example, I've had many survivors that were advised, you can't relocate with your children, but they were like, fuck it, I'm leaving because he's about to kill me and I'm going to deal with the consequences later. The important piece is that we're helping survivors make those informed decisions. So we're facilitating their access to legal advice. And that legal advice isn't just telling them, here's what you should or shouldn't do. It's also helping them understand, okay, what are the possible consequences of either decision that they make and what is the likely outcome. I've had a lawyer actually tell a survivor, if you do move and, this much time has passed, chances are you might get a slap on the wrist by the time it gets to court. But at that point, you'll have established like status quo. And I'm not advising anyone, obviously, to go against legal advice. I'm just, suggesting that, we facilitate for survivors to be able to make these informed decisions. But at the end of the day, they're going to make the decision that's best for them. And we still support survivors in that decision that they've made. Even if it's not, what we think is ideal, at the end of the day, I've seen survivors do amazing things, and I've seen survivors get away with making the decision that was best for them and their children. And in the end, they knew what was best for them. They knew the risk that they were willing to take. And, they knew the risk in actually not taking that other risk, right? So it's about, informed consent at all times when we're supporting survivors or when we're managing things that survivors are asking us to do on their behalf as well. And also ensuring that survivors maintain access to all of their information. Oftentimes, things are done in the background on behalf of a survivor and they don't quite understand what's happening in their case. And because I work with a lot of newcomer women, this is often the case for them. So I try to ensure that documents are translated so they can refer back to them later, like a court order or like a major document that they really need to understand what just happened here. Because it might be oftentimes people get like interpretation in the moment for something that's happening, but you don't really that's an overwhelming time. So you don't really know. I've had survivors that didn't even know. I've had 2 survivors that like time had passed and they were completely divorced and did not actually know that they were divorced. They still thought that they were going to go through a divorce process, right? So, in that moment where things are really overwhelming, there's only so much information you capture. And like for me, I can go back and refer to documents over and over again and read them over and over again, right? But, when you aren't well-resourced to understand what those documents say, and to be able to refer back to them, and even if you use an online translator, like to really understand what those documents are saying. And then we always make sure that we summarize and follow up with information to a survivor afterwards if it's needed. So especially if there's multiple next steps that they need to work on. We assist in completing forms, in coming up with questions to ask at their legal or other consultation based on their concerns and needs, because oftentimes survivors are, telling you this whole big thing that they're dealing with, but it's hard to kind of narrow down, okay, based on like what you've described, these sound like some important questions that you need to get answers for before you take this or that step, right? So knowing the right questions to ask, you have to have a good understanding of the system and how it works to be able to ask the questions that are going to help you make those informed decisions. So these are some of the ways that we support survivors in navigating the system. I just want to pause for a second and ask if you want to add anything here, Samaya, before I move to the advocacy slide.
Yeah, so it's balancing between giving your survivor that autonomy, but also understanding that in the height of your crisis, you are often missing a lot of the pieces because you're in crisis. So it's like having someone on a water raft and saying, well, how do you feel right now? Are you doing okay? And it's like, well, I'm drowning. So, this is navigating. When do you do that emotional piece? And when do you do that navigation piece? And when do you ask survivors to tap into skills that they should be learning? I know Rifa has this really cool story about, shelters asking survivors to figure out how to use e-transfers when they just want to get stuff done right now. And I guess Rifa can share a bit of that if you want to step in.
Yeah, sure. So I was assisting a survivor with a safety relocation, and the landlord, usually there's just a very short timeline to get this stuff done. And, she had a place to move right away. She didn't have a shelter that would take her in because of some of the, I don't want to share any identifying information, but some of the stuff around her kids, it meant that she couldn't access a shelter space, and she needed a place to move into right away. And it was really time sensitive. Her abuser was showing up at her place every day, despite a restraining order and things like that. And so she needed to send an e-transfer to this landlord like right now. And this landlord was already like kind of sketched out. It doesn't usually work in your interest when you are a newcomer, you don't speak English, you don't have a work history, you don't have credit history. Your income is almost half of the rent that you're expected to pay. And you're just like, well, I'm just praying that money's going to fall from the sky and I'm going to be able to, survivors are kind of just like, fuck it, I'm going to do it now and figure the rest out later. But so she really had to secure this place, get the thing, and the shelter workers were adamant about this whole thing that she needed to like know how to send her own e-transfer. You know, they were like really actually helpful and collaborative in working together. And it's not always the case that you get service providers that are really willing to collaborate and work together to kind of get the thing the survivor needs done. But they were really stuck on this point, like she needs to learn how to send an e-transfer. And I'm like, this is not the time for this woman to learn this skill. She just wants you to do the thing so that she can like move forward right now. You know, she's about to leave her community, flee to another city far away. Like there's a million things on her mind. And this is, you know, we heard a lot about the window of tolerance from Natty over the last couple of days. You know, this is not the time for learning that particular skill, but, you know, just a couple weeks forward, that survivor was running her own life she already was running her own life, but she was doing all kinds of amazing shit. She got a job without a word of English. She did all kinds of things that, you know, reflect her independence and her ability to figure things out, right? But in that moment of crisis, there's a lot of pressure, you know, where service providers have this idea that we need to help people feel empowered to, you know, do things for themselves. And sometimes that's not necessarily, you know, what that survivor needs in that moment or what's possible in that moment. So the advocacy. So, you know, this story connects to this point that, you know, this idea that we have to empower survivors to make them do everything for themselves is, you know, part of the privilege that we have, right? In that moment that we think, you know, that this is actually what I think you need, what's important to you, right? For you, right? And, you know, it's also about this lack of understanding that I find often of the challenges of advocating for yourself when you're in crisis or when so much is on the line for you, like when it's your own personal stuff. Survivors often say things to me like, whoa, you were able to describe my situation or write this letter in a way that I never can, or in a very succinct or eloquent way. I just fumble and say all the wrong things. And then I'm like, oh no, like, why did I say that? Or that's not what I wanted to share or whatever. So the thing is that I can do that in small part because of my knowledge of the system and, you know, whatever professional skills I have. But mostly it's because despite the deep care that I have for the challenges the survivor is facing, it's not my own stuff. You know, looking back, I was known in our family and close circles as the person to go to get things sorted out, whether it was a problem with the insurance company or expired work visa. Friends and family would even ask me to like call as themselves, like, can you call and be me and just like work this thing out? But when it came to my own housing application, when my life was at risk, forget it. I took that rejection letter and I couldn't even make myself appeal it. It was too much. It was too big. It was too overwhelming. And there was no one to hold my hand and say, here, like, I'll do it with you, or even I'll do it for you if you want, you know? And so, you know, we really have to be mindful of that piece around, you know, what our understanding is of, encouraging survivors to do things for themselves, or even forcing survivors to do things for themselves that maybe they would really like someone to take on a more active role in. And so it's somewhere that we can lend our privilege if that's something that the survivor would like. You know, survivors are constantly denied the most basic things because they apparently don't tick the right boxes. And service providers have policy so far up their ass, they can't pause and see the human that is in front of them, and, you know, just look at their situation without looking at these boxes, right? Like, well, it says here that you haven't lived with your abuser in the last 3 months. Okay, yeah, but the police just showed up and said he's ordered a hit on you. He's got a firearm. You need to get out. So where do I go? You know, but in their mind, they're looking at this thing and they're like, okay, you're not ticking the right boxes. And that appeal process is not even easy. Oftentimes it takes weeks and weeks. For one survivor, I literally spent an entire month just on fighting for that, gathering letters, everything. And we got to the point where they were going to have that, I forget what they call it, but it was like some sort of a hearing where they were going to now like debate whether they were going to override that requirement. They got us to that point, and minutes before that call started, they said, okay, actually, we've decided not to put the survivor through this and approve your application. Like, are you kidding me? You could have done that all along, but it was, to think like that survivor, the danger that she was dealing with and the fear that she was dealing with and everything that she was navigating, and having to wait that whole month, gather these letters, beg people to like write these support letters from, the VWAP worker to the victim services, to getting the police reports, to everything, only for them to actually be able to make that decision minutes before the hearing, which says that they didn't need to do that at all, right? They could have actually tuned into what was going on much sooner. And the reality is that, that time that I spent that whole month working on that for a survivor, this was before I was, doing this role formally. And so I had the time at that time, because I was a stay-at-home mom, and I literally dedicated all that time to just be like, we're going to get this fucking thing approved. Nobody, like service providers people who are supporting survivors don't have that kind of time and resources to expect. So this survivor would not have ever gotten that approval, right? She would just fall through the cracks, or, stay where she is, or, with the risk that she was facing, she would, potentially be harmed, and her children. And knowing the amount of work that went into that, no organization would actually, aside from Women at the Center, no other organization would actually allow their staff to expend this amount of energy to, get one approval.
I can jump in there. That's where Women at the Center, being survivor centered, is different. There's so many times where our funding has ended and the survivor is just at the end of whatever they're going through. And I just want to support that last stage. And I've called like my ED, I've called like the program coordinators, and I said, hey, like, I know that I'm supposed to be done with this person, but like, we really need to get this thing done. And they've always said, do what you need to do at your discretion. So supporting your staff in supporting survivors is also key, and obviously staying within the scope of your funding, right? But at the same time, like, this is somebody's life. This is a human experience. This decision may affect the trajectory of the rest of their life. Like, these are not just numbers. These are people. These are lives. And I think that when you really take that approach, you really do your best to ensure that you're advocating for a person as if you would advocate for yourself. And also, when you work with the systems, you start to figure out that there are a lot of loopholes that is not generally known to the general public. So asking survivors to navigate systems without that knowledge of, well, there is this exception, or if you talk to this person, or if you have this letter, or if you go through this way to do this thing, then you will get the yes. When you've been doing this for a long time, you get to basically, and it's really sad that you have to figure out how to beat the system, right? But this is what we have to do. And I think one of the key pieces here also is that when we're talking to the different systems, we're not giving the entire story of the survivor. We're only giving them the piece they need. Because often if the survivor is telling the police, for example, their entire story, parts of that story doesn't work in their best interest to tell the police, or to tell their, their landlord, or tell the teacher. So ensuring that only the piece that is needed to ensure they get the best possible outcome is shared. That's where that system navigation piece comes in. And obviously we have consent forms that we're able to talk to these different systems, and we always keep survivors in the process. So they're part of that conversation. They're often sitting there, when we go into meetings with survivors, and they we go into a meeting and they understand this is what happened in the meeting, and then it's because at the height of their crisis, they're not understanding exactly what happened in that meeting. So having that follow up and saying, well, this is actually what happened, and these are your options, and these are the things we can do, and these are, you know, different avenues we can take, but just keeping them informed during that process is also key. So that's how this advocacy kind of works.
And sorry, I'm just going to stay on that slide for a minute, Samaya. So, you know, one thing that I see often, especially in supporting newcomer survivors who have a language barrier and require a lot of background work done for them, is that, you know, a support worker would do all of this work and the survivor would be like, well, actually, I don't want to do this anymore. And there's this frustration of like, well, I did all of this work, you know? So really thinking about how we are just removing as many barriers as we can to make more options available and supporting survivors to be able to make the most informed decisions about what they need. And sometimes, you know, it turns out that, like, I often encourage survivors when a decision is overwhelming to take some time and think about it without taking an immediate step in that moment that might create additional barriers if they decide outside of that moment where they may be overwhelmed or triggered that actually they do want to take that step. So, and around the piece that Samaya mentioned, you know, one thing I often do is find out what a service provider will need to know to help a survivor feel prepared for that meeting, going into that meeting, because oftentimes, you know, when they ask open-ended questions, survivors don't know how much or what they need to share. So if we have a chance to know what are the questions that you're going to ask, what are the things that you need to know, the survivor can also do a little bit of prep before going into that meeting, knowing what kind of information she needs to share, how much information she needs to share. And we can also lend that information that helps them know, like, you know, based on that organization's mandate, this is what they need to know about, right? If you're an organization that is providing a specific, you know, resource for survivors of, you know, I don't know, child sexual abuse, right? A survivor coming in is not going to know what aspect of her experience she needs to share to be able to access that resource. And, you know, especially when you don't have that knowledge of the system and knowledge of even the language, you know, then it makes it really challenging to qualify and access those resources. So in the coming slides, we're going to look at a resource that we created internally to assist counselors in providing support to survivors. This series of flowcharts can guide support workers in identifying key things that they should consider in various systems. So they're not intended to be exhaustive. As you'll see, there's only so much that you can include on one page. And counselors will also really rely on their own knowledge and experience and the priorities that the survivor identifies as well. But if there are any thoughts that you want to share as we go through these next slides, you can feel free to share in the chat any additional considerations that you might like to see included as well. I'll pass it to you, Samaya.
So when a survivor comes to us, they're looking for support. And there's 4 types of support we generally offer. One is the system navigation that we've been talking about. The peer counseling piece, which is usually the emotional piece. A lot of folks just come to us because they're just trying to figure out how to navigate the isolation that they're going through. And the case support management is what we've talked about here, is where we're, you know, communicating with different systems to ensure that their needs are met. A lot of times you'll keep seeing like the consent form is there for different parts of these things, emailing the survivor a session summary so they understand like what we just went through, so that there's no discrepancy with what was said and what was understood. Accompanying to appointments if needed. I mean, we do work across Canada, so if we're able to do that piece, we will do that piece. We can't always guarantee that that's something we can do. And there's also a sliding scale. So not everyone is going to get all these different pieces. Intersectionality is important. So some folks, as we've talked about, come in with that extra layers of, being a newcomer, the language barrier, they might be going through the family law, they might be going through criminal law. Like there's a lot more layers, and it depends on what the survivor needs and how much time it will take to support them. If there's domestic violence disclosure, there's a lot that goes into it. So you can see that if someone discloses domestic violence or intimate partner violence, there's that big piece of safety planning. And safety planning is extensive. It depends if they're still living with their abuser. It depends if they're trying to flee a city. There's little things that we've figured out as we've supported folks is a lot of times survivors have, like, for example, their phone is still in the abuser's name. So they have access to phone records. So ensuring that like the plan is changed so that they can't see the backlog calls. I've asked survivors to create like emails at libraries so that email address is not on their phone, and they specifically go to the library to, apply for this thing that goes to this email. Or if there's things going on and they're not ready to leave that relationship, but they want to document what's happening, I often tell them, well, send like a brief summary of what happened to that email address that you're only accessing at this safe space. To be honest, tech safety is something that, we all need more training on. I think a lot of organizations need more training on because, as the world is changing, and as the world is changing, the way that we are harmed is also changed. If there's police involvement, things get a little bit complicated, and a lot of times folks don't understand what does it mean if police is involved? Does it mean that this person can never contact me again? Or does this mean that this person is going to prison? Like, they don't understand a lot of times what that means, and the fact that police involvement doesn't ensure necessarily safety. I'm going to go to the next slide just because I'm mindful of time. If there's sexual assault disclosure, it depends on if it's recent. So if it's recent, what I always suggest is going to a hospital just to get that support and some documentation, not necessarily for taking it into a criminal court process. Often just having somewhere where something is documented that it happened to you is enough validation for the survivor in their healing journey, even if it sits in that, it sits in a file for years and years and years. Or I've had survivors who did not want to do anything with the sexual assault the first year, but like the second year, as they were able to process what happened, they decided they wanted to move forward with something. Safety planning, the strangulation support is key too. Like for a lot of times in disclosure of sexual assault, we're not talking about strangulation, and that's a big piece. There's a lot of strangulation support in hospitals now as well. Another thing to be mindful of is in the intersectional experience, for a lot of folks, the hospital is not a safe space. So being mindful that not all folks are going to feel safe in a medical setting. So having advocates maybe from a rape crisis center to go with folks to these appointments, and making sure that they're supported in the process, and they're really having autonomy in this as well. I'm going to go to the next slide.
Okay, that's the immigration one. I can't see on that screen, so I'm going to look at a different screen here. So I'll be looking away. So for immigration, we kind of sorted it into, survivors who don't have status in Canada, survivors who may be recent immigrant or refugee, and survivors who have been here much longer. And, some of the considerations that we need to be aware of. So when we're supporting survivors who don't have status, they may need legal advice if they haven't gotten it already. That will help them, determine what services they're going to have access to that are going to be impacted by their by which application route that they take. So, for example, people who are making a humanitarian application versus people who are making a refugee application is really going to impact their ability to apply for services. So once you submit a refugee application, you immediately start having access to some of those services like healthcare, housing, social assistance or ODSP, some of these things. So this also helps us to know, what's going to happen. And so we need to stay, as we're supporting survivors, we need to stay closely aware of what's going on, with that, that legal information that they're getting, because this is going to determine, some of the paths that we have to navigate with the survivors and figure out, okay, what resources would they qualify for? What's, what other options do we have and things like that, and knowing what some of the challenges that they're going to face are. Again, we have to be aware of interpretation, support with making that application, access to healthcare for uninsured folks. And then, when we're thinking about, recent immigrant refugee women who are accessing settlement services, there are many settlement services that are available to support survivors, but that wraparound case management support, is only available in the earlier months for example, for a government-assisted refugee. And then it's far less concentrated in that first year. And then after that, there's only specific supports that newcomers can get help with, depending on where they are and the services that they have access to. But it's also important to know that even though we're not settlement workers, survivors have their abuser often accessing the same agency that they're accessing support from. Sometimes he has allies within the same agency. I've supported several refugee women whose abuser was not just being supported by the agency, but also there were workers that were divulging confidential information that put her at risk, or there was a real lack of policy within the agency that can ensure that information is not crossed over between workers that are working together. Sometimes agencies don't even have the knowledge that they shouldn't have the same workers supporting both people. So how are you helping this person stay safe and, with, meet all of their needs at the same time that you're supporting him with accessing legal advice and having access to the children? There's a huge conflict of interest there. And, sometimes even it's been that the aggressor was someone that was influential in the community or was connected to the agency. And this made it difficult for them to, not be on the receiving end of bias. And, that conflict of interest of really being able to access that support. And the other thing is that survivors' needs are intertwined, and sometimes settlement workers are not as willing to tag team closely to ensure that, we're both working to the same end. So there become, a lot of conflicts in ensuring that we're working towards the same goal with the survivor, and it's not getting very confusing. So at the request of the survivor, of course, our support may involve things that could have been covered by another program, for some of these reasons that we shared. Okay, so legal issues. So, as we're supporting survivors navigating some of these legal issues that we're dealing with, a lot of different legal issues can come up. And so, sometimes survivors are accessing legal support for their immigration case separately from the legal support that they're accessing for their family court case. They may also have a criminal court case going on. I've had a survivor, dealing with actually many survivors dealing with multiple of these different legal systems at the same time. So just being aware of the different areas of laws that could be, impacting, the support that the survivor needs, and some of the resources that can assist with some of these. For example, there's community legal clinics, legal helplines like Pro Bono Ontario, Legal Aid, online resources that can help you get information and understand. Often looking through these online resources actually helps survivors to prepare for their legal consultation, because they get a better sense of what's involved. So they're not coming into those very limited, maybe they have like a 2-hour consultation or, a 30-minute legal consultation, right? So rather than using that to just get educated about like the basic aspects, and now you're not being able to utilize that time very efficiently, it's helpful for the survivor to have support and kind of knowing what some of those questions are and what some of the issues are, so that they can best focus their time that is usually very limited for them to get legal advice and legal support. Do you want to talk about this, or should I?
I can step in. So if there's children involved, it usually gets a little bit more complicated. And one of the things to start thinking about is childcare. There are so many childcare subsidy programs. There's a lot of community programs that will subsidize care. A lot of folks don't even know about these programs that are available to them. There's nutrition programs available in schools. There's a lot of community programs that offer clothing, food, parenting support. Just when children are involved with safety planning as well, it gets a little bit more complicated, and having folks understand like what are the legal like implications of doing this thing, or what do they have to consider if there's children for this thing. Just having that knowledge and being informed during the process, and being able to access all the resources that are available to them during that process usually is very validating for survivors as they're navigating the system. Is there anything you wanted to add, Rifa?
Yeah, I was just going to add, thank you. I was just going to add that, when we're supporting a survivor, usually the survivor is like officially the client of our organization, or the person that we're providing that direct support to. But oftentimes survivors are also caregivers to elderly parents, to a disabled sibling, to children, grandchildren. And so, supporting survivors with knowing and accessing some of these resources helps alleviate a lot of the challenges of just, whether it's the financial challenges, whether it's figuring out like, being able to help a survivor find summer, like free weeks of summer camp, March break camp, PA day camps, really helps to alleviate some of that burden that they have to deal with all of these things on their own, and even allow for respite care, even if the survivor is not working or in school and they're at home. Oftentimes they're not getting support from anyone else in the community. All of the responsibility of the caregiving is on them, and they don't have that downtime or that space to maybe just disconnect for a little bit, or have some respite and time of their own. Again, about the parenting support, a lot of times survivors are dealing with all of these issues, and it becomes very difficult as the survivor and themselves are dealing with a lot of challenges, to have that support that they need. So again, helping survivors to access, resources that can assist them with some of the parenting challenges that they're having, really helps to alleviate, again, some of that burden of like all of the things that they're dealing with, and really allow a little bit of space for them to breathe.
The language barrier is a big one. We've talked about it. What I did want to add, and it's not necessarily on the slide, is the intersectional experience. So this is, the baseline is if you have someone who's racialized or has a disability or has, this language barrier, those are added barriers for the system navigation. So we really want to consider that when we're supporting survivors, is what are the unique needs for this particular person, and how do we support them best? For the language, we do have interpretation. The truth is that sometimes it does take time. So like it says, it takes appointments usually take 2 times as much as that we usually require. A lot of times service providers don't have that time. Women at the Center is really great that they allot us the time that we need to support survivors based on their needs. Importing documents, I think Rifa, you talked about going through that and having them have access to things so they understand the process. I think
I was just going to jump in with one point, is that oftentimes, survivors who speak like enough English to be able to communicate with you, but at the same time, probably not enough English to pick up everything and completely understand everything. I've had a few instances where, the survivor I'm working with does need a little bit of that interpretation support, but it becomes a really frustrating process for them because the interpreter is like trying to be like, wait, because you can only say like a couple of sentences at a time and they have to like interpret everything. So, you might not want to use an interpreter to interpret everything during like a very important session or a consultation or something like that. But it's still really good to have the interpreter on standby to ensure that, any pieces that do need to get translated, that you do have that support on the call. And really checking in to see, I noticed like with a couple of survivors, they're just getting really frustrated because it's like, no, I just want to finish saying what I have to say. I don't want someone to interrupt me every 10 seconds, right? So I really had to, ask the interpreter to like, take a step back and just like check in with the survivor, like if they wanted everything translated or if they wanted to call on the interpreter. And so then we kind of moved to just having the interpreters on standby to make sure that they're able to have like, very specific information thoroughly understood, but not have that be like a way to kind of control how the session goes, where the survivor isn't able to just kind of take the lead and take the session wherever they want.
Go ahead. What I wanted to add too is a lot of the times the language, there is an emphasis on using the correct language, but for folks, a lot of the times like using certain language is a barrier because simple language is key when you're communicating with survivors, especially when there's a language barrier, even when there's not. Like if you're dealing with a senior, there's a lot of tech barriers too that we didn't have noted here. So when a lot of the intake process is now being done through technology, and that can be really challenging for folks who haven't had access to these things, or for elderly folks who don't have access to even navigating like screens and these kind of things, or someone with a brain injury who doesn't have a screen that accommodates their needs. Like these are things that we may think, oh, they can do this, but it's not that simple.
So the next few slides are kind of, additional systems, like including, income and financial. It's quite a busy slide. We won't take you through all of it, but just to see like the different ways, having that kind of, ways of thinking about all the different things that, might come up as you're supporting a survivor with financial issues or with housing. I think the next slide would be housing. Are just ways of thinking about the different systems that survivors are navigating and the different, some of the different considerations that can come up. And obviously there's going to be a lot of things that survivors identify as either resources they want to access or as priorities that they have that would not be included in this as well. So we just wanted to leave a few minutes to check in. If anybody has any questions or any comments they want to make, you can feel free to pop those in the chat. And I'll just give a couple minutes to see if anything comes up in the chat. Yes, absolutely. I see a comment here that a survivor might be able to converse in English, but the abuse takes an impact on, takes a toll on their mental faculties. To be compassionate and patient is helpful while the process information. Absolutely. Yes, as well as brain injury impacting memory. And that's why we make sure to, take notes and share those with the survivor, specifically around, if we've had a meeting together and, there's specific information that they're going to want to be able to retain, say they've gotten legal advice and they're not, they would find it helpful to have those notes afterwards to be able to recall what happened during that session and to be able to follow up on that information or next steps and things like that.
If there's any questions that you don't want to put in the chat, I'll have someone put our email addresses in the chat. So if you can just send those questions to our personal email addresses, and we'll try to answer them to the best of our abilities. But I do want to thank you for taking the time to listen to us and share the little bit of knowledge that we do have on system navigation.
Thank you all so much for joining us today, and we hope that you've taken some things that will help you in whatever capacity you support survivors, whether formally or informally. Yes, I do see a question about Francophone counselors, so we do have a French-speaking counselor as well on our team.